Welcome, friends, to At Home with Theosophy. We are exploring the subject, The Power of Thought, based on a book written by Annie Besant. So today we are going to continue with the exploration of the first chapters of the book. We will start with the one called The Creator of Illusion. And that chapter begins with a quote from The Voice of the Silence that says, "Having become indifferent to objects of perception, the pupil must seek out the Raja of the senses." Raja means the king in Sanskrit. So the pupil must seek out the Raja of the senses, the thought producer, he who awakes illusion. The mind is the great slayer of the real. So as we see in this quote and the title of the chapter, there is the idea that the mind it's an instrument that we have to perceive the world, but it does not present the world as it is. It creates some kind of illusion. It slays the real. This is quite different from what we normally think. From the time of the Enlightenment in Europe, the idea is that thought, reason, thinking is the highest faculty that we have. And of course, in the postmodern era in which we are right now, scientists and philosophers and thinkers have come to a realization of the limitation of thinking, the limitation of mind. But the big difference between the postmodern view about the limitations of the mind and the theosophical view or the spiritual view in general is that in the spiritual approach, we don't limit human beings to the level of mind, emotions, and physical actions. We postulate there are higher faculties than this. In the regular view with scholars and thinkers, there is the impression that our thought is intrinsically limited, and since there is no idea or theory about anything higher than thought, frequently there is a nihilistic point of view or a cynical point of view about human beings and existence in general. So we will see how Annie Besant explains why the mind creates illusion. And eventually part of the book, the idea is to learn how to use the mind properly so that it distorts as little as possible perception, but also so that we can learn how to go beyond the perception of the mind. So she starts right away with what I was mentioning, that there is something higher than the mind. She says, the mind is not the knower and should ever be carefully distinguished from him. So by the knower, she means the self. Remember, she talked, we saw this in our previous class, she talked about the self as having three aspects. One of them is the aspect of knowing, and the self is the knower. Now, the knower is not the same as the thinker. Thinking is a way of knowledge through a particular faculty, but the self as knower is able to know things beyond thinking, as we are going to see. Anyway, she says that we need to distinguish carefully between us as the knower, the one that is able to perceive, to realize, to understand, but normally understanding we relate it to the idea of thinking. There is an understanding that is more of an insight, is the ability to grasp reality or what we are perceiving. So all these things belong to the self. The means by which we gain knowledge or understanding, when we do it through the mind, that belongs to the instrument of knowledge at that level, which is the mind. And she says many of the confusions and the difficulties that perplex the student arise because he does not remember the distinction between him who knows and the mind, which is his instrument for obtaining knowledge. It is though the sculptor were identified with his chisel. This mind limits the jiva. Remember, she used the word jiva for center of consciousness, which as self-consciousness increases, as we develop more of what today we may call self-awareness, the jiva finds himself hampered by the mind on every side. So as I explained in the previous class, the mind is necessary, it's a necessary instrument. Eventually, it becomes an obstacle for the further growth of the jiva, of our spiritual nature. As we are going to see, that doesn't mean we need to destroy the mind. When we talk about like the voice of the silence continues, Annie Besant didn't quote that part, but it continues saying that let the disciple slay the slayer, slay the mind. We will see that by that, the idea is not to destroy the mind, but is to purify it and to learn how to work free from the limitations that the mind imposes. So she continues, the mind on the side life is manas. Remember that she mentioned there are always two aspects to anything manifested. The life side or the consciousness side, and then the form or material side. So on the side of consciousness, we have this thing that in Theosophy we call manas, using the Sanskrit word, that is basically the consciousness working on a mental level. And she says that this manas is the reflection on the mental plane of the cognitional aspect of the self as knower. So of these three aspects that we saw, on the mental plane, the aspect of the self as knower manifests. So manas is the consciousness aspect. But that consciousness, as we explored, always needs a vehicle of expression. It needs a body, a form through which the activities of consciousness may express. So this belongs to the side of matter or form. And she says on the side of form, it presents two aspects, severally conditioning the activity of manas, the consciousness working on the mental plane. So there are two manasic vehicles of consciousness, two mental vehicles of consciousness that she's going to describe. The first and higher aspect of the form side of the mind is called causal body or abstract mind. It is composed of matter from the higher subdivisions of the mental plane. So the mental plane is divided in 7 subplanes, each subplane being formed by a kind of mental matter, which is more or less dense, more or less spiritual, let's say. Just as on the physical plane, we have solid matter, we have liquid matter, we have gases, and we have plasma. On all the other planes, there is also matter that is in different states. Physical matter is very good for certain things, but is too rigid for others. So liquids are more useful for other things. Like to sustain life in us, our blood is liquid because it has to move around the body. It wouldn't work if it was solid. And similarly, at the mental level, there is matter on different states, and the different states serve for different purposes. However, on the mental level, we have a characteristic that there are two different bodies. There is a body that is made of only the three higher subplanes. This is a very spiritual mental body, very attuned to what we could call our spiritual nature, not so much to what we can call our material nature. So it's not really all that able to interact with the material aspect of ourselves. And this is called the causal body. She says this causal body is little developed in the majority of people at the present age of evolution or stage of evolution, as it remains unaffected by the mental activities directed to external objects. It is, in fact, the organ of abstract thought. So in the theosophical view, we evolve the different bodies basically by means of consciousness working within those bodies. So although science would postulate evolution as being the result of random changes in the physical body through mutations, etc., and then an external force, the so-called natural selection, selecting what changes that from that point of view are random, what changes just happen to be good. The theosophical tradition would postulate that all these changes are actually being stimulated by the presence of consciousness. It is consciousness that is constantly pushing the different vehicles, physical, emotional, mental, etc., is pushing those vehicles so that they develop, expand, organize, and eventually become proper vehicles of consciousness, proper vehicles of expression. So she says that the causal body at this point in evolution is little developed in most people because the causal body is connected to activities that she calls abstract thought, which is partly I think, correct to present it in that way, but also it may produce some confusion. Abstract thought means a kind of thinking, a kind of understanding that is not based on what the senses bring, that is not based on objects, that is not based on things that our personal nature can readily grasp. So, for example, there is a difference between a right action and the idea of righteousness. A right action is quite concrete, and I may be inclined to act correctly to avoid being put in jail by the police. So this is something clear, concrete, that anybody having a mind can understand. And this is part of the work of what we are going to see next, the lower mind, the concrete mind. Now, some people may act in the right way simply because they grasp the sense that righteousness is good in itself, regardless of any particular example, regardless of any particular effect, concrete effect, whether it is, punishment or reward. The grasping of the importance of righteousness, that is grasped by the abstract mind. This is why the concept of, God in religion tends to be very concrete, anthropomorphic, very much in connection to an exchange of favors. I pray, you give me something in return. And because that's the level of perception of the lower mind. More, let's say, subtler or more spiritual conceptions of God or anything else require the work of this higher mind. Now, our regular daily life very rarely stimulates this higher activity. At this point in evolution, most of our activities around the lower mind and the emotions and the physical body. Our culture is not really, has not developed to the point where activities related to this more abstract or spiritual mind are predominant. Just as intellectual activities were not predominant in our culture, let's say in the West, before the Renaissance and Enlightenment, and then little by little, our culture became more and more intellectual. In a similar way, our culture is not geared toward this higher spiritual mind. And because consciousness is not actively working there, the causal body in most people in humanity is little developed. It is by means of these kind of studies and meditation, trying to grasp the higher aspects of life, etc., that we start stimulating the activity on the causal body and also its evolution. So that's the first body, the higher mental body. And then the second, she says, is called the mental body. So the first one was the causal body, which is also a kind of mental body because it's on the mental plane, on the higher subplanes of the mental plane. But the names we use for one is causal body, for the other is mental body. So the second aspect is called mental body or the concrete mind. And it is composed of mental matter belonging to the 4 lower subdivisions of the mental plane. We shall confine the term mind in the following paragraphs to the concrete mind, the mental body, and manas, manas being the mental consciousness. So in most of the book, when she talks about the mind, she's talking about the concrete mind, the mental body. Toward the end of the book, she talks more about the higher mind or the causal body, which, as I was mentioning, begins to enter into activity more as we engage in spiritual disciplines or activities. But basically, what we are going to discuss in most of the class has to do with the mental body, the body that is formed with the 4 lower subplanes, and that we use as our everyday life mind, the concrete mind. So she says, the mind is a thing, precise and definite, with certain powers and incapacities, strength and weakness, which are the outcome of activities in previous lives. It is as we have made it, the result of past thinking, and is constantly being modified by present thinking. We cannot change it save slowly. We cannot transcend it by an effort of the will, nor instantaneously remove its imperfections. So she's trying to bring a sense of, many times when we think of the mind, we may think of something vague. She's saying the mind is a thing, it's a body, it has a structure, it has its own limitations. That structure may be built with different kind of matter, it may be built to a different degree of complexity, organization. It's something concrete, from a certain point of view, as concrete as the physical body. We can't just will the physical body into perfection. We have to work with the physical body to, produce changes in the body if we need to. And also we receive a body that has its own limitations. This body is the result of our previous activity. Of course, we have all kinds of activities connected to the body. So in different incarnations, we inherit different kinds of bodies, responding to different sets of causes that we produced. So in one lifetime, we may have a very healthy body, and in the next one, we may have a very unhealthy body. That doesn't mean that the previous life was wrong or something. It's just that we have a lot of accumulated karma, and we just choose different aspects of it to work out in any particular incarnation. With the mental body, it's a little different in the sense that, according to Besant at least, the previous karma is normally, the limitations of previous karma is normally set at the physical level. So at the level of our emotional body or the mental body, our mental body is what we have built in previous incarnations. Now, if because of karma, we need to experience some mental limitations, for example, then that is set by producing a brain or a nervous system or a hormonal system that imposes certain limitations to the activity of the mental body. So we have a mental body that has a certain degree of maturity or evolution. It has a certain structure. And then that mental body is trying to express itself through the body, the physical body, which sets also its own limitations according to karma. So in the same way that we cannot just will the body into a complete change, she says we cannot do the same with the mental body. We have to work little by little on it, progressively. Now, we can grow at the level of the mental body far faster than it normally happens when we are not really focused on that kind of work, and she's going to mention this later. But nevertheless, we are working with a structure that has its own limitations, its own inertia, its own rules. So she says, as a result of past thinking, each mind has its own rate of vibration, being in a state of perpetual motion, offering ever-changing series of pictures. You see, if you look at your mind, the mind is always thinking something. There are always images going through the mind. Now, Annie Besant would say that's not real thinking. This change of pictures that happens automatically is just that. Is, if you are clairvoyant and you see the mental body of the person, you see all these images running through the mental body. The mental body has this restless tendency to produce these kind of images. So when we walk from here to there, we are most of the time even not aware of what the mental body is doing. But it's always in this state of vibration, restlessness, producing pictures. Annie Besant, as we will see in other classes, says, thinking is the active, conscious activity where we are directing the mental images and we are connecting them, establishing relationships. That is true thinking. This automatic thinking is, we call it thinking, but it's not. And then she says, every impression coming to us from outside is made on this already active sphere, and the mass of existing vibrations modifies and is modified by the new arrival. The resultant is not, therefore, an accurate reproduction of the new vibrations, but a combination of it with the vibrations already proceeding in our mental body. So we talked about this briefly in our previous class. Our mind is always moving, is always vibrating. So anything we perceive from the outside, whether we perceive it through the senses, the sound that you are hearing right now, that your senses receive, and then they are translated into concepts, and those concepts in that you are hearing are interacting with your mental motion and also with your mental vibration. So when we talk about conditioning of the mind, it's referring to this kind of vibration. We say something, and that something may sound offensive to some people and not to others. And, supposing that it is not, there are some things that most society will, interpret as offensive. But many times there are other things that are not. And if I feel that they are offensive, that has to do with my own rate of vibration that tends to filter certain kind of information as offensive. Now, I may be right or wrong. I may be sensitive to certain things that other people are not, or it may be a conditioning that I tend to interpret things in that way due to past experience and basically to what kind of vibration my mental body has. But we all have a particular kind of vibration, and we all tend to interpret the world in a particular way. That is our conditioning. Whether we tend to be naive and optimistic or pessimistic or afraid or this or that, that's, we all perceive the same reality, but then our minds interpret the same reality in different ways. So again, that's part of our conditioning. And then also because of our activity, we may misinterpret things. So it's obvious that we need to be aware that our mind is not presenting reality as it is. It is presenting reality in a particular color, so to say, which Annie Besant is going to use as example. So she says, the influence of the mind as a medium by which the knower views the external world is very similar to the influence of the colored glass on the colors of the objects seen through it. The knower, the self, is unconscious or as unconscious of this influence of the mind as a person who had never seen except through red or blue glasses would be unconscious of the changes made by the glasses in the colors of the landscape. So if all my life I've seen through blue glasses, I have no idea that reality is different. I assume that this is how reality is. And then when a person with red glasses starts discussing reality with me or the perception of reality, we will disagree because we have different conditioning. So similarly, it's very difficult to realize this intrinsic, innate conditioning that each one of us have. How do you realize that you are not seeing reality in the example that Besant gives here? Well, you realize it if you have the possibility of removing the glasses, even if for a few seconds. Then when you put the glasses on, you know you had a different glimpse, and you know that the glasses are distorting reality. You may forget how reality really is without the glasses, but now you know that the glasses are coloring your perception. So similarly, we can realize that our mind is conditioned as we become more in touch with, let's call them transmental perceptions. And by this, I don't mean psychic senses. The psychic senses are still working through the emotional body or the mental body without going through the physical body. That's the only difference. So even psychic senses can be as biased and conditioned as the physical ones. But if we learn to perceive with a quiet mind, if you learn to be in a state of silent awareness, then you start getting a sense of how our minds are always building a particular story, a particular interpretation on life, which you realize now by contrast when you are aware to just being present without letting the mind introduce its own color. So Besant says, this phenomena that we described is the superficial and obvious sense in which the mind is called the creator of illusion. This is quite clear. If the mind is distorting perception, there you are not seeing reality as it is. You are seeing your own personal illusion. It presents us only with distorted images, a combination of itself, its own movement, and the external object, the movement that is produced through the perception of external objects. But the mind is also a creator of illusion in a far deeper sense, in that even these distorted images are but images of appearances, not of realities. Shadows of shadows are all that it gives us. So she's saying there is a deeper layer here of illusion that even if we were to perceive correctly what our senses bring, we are seeing correctly, but that thing that we see correctly is not even reality. We are seeing the appearance of reality in a correct way. Normally we see the appearance of reality in a distorted way. But even if we could see it perfectly, we are still not seeing reality. The mind is a mechanism of representing reality in a particular way, just like the icons on the computer are not real objects there. There is a software that is creating certain images for you to be able to relate to the information on the computer. So you have a square icon that looks like a sheet of paper, and you click on it and you write. That square icon is just created by the computer. It has nothing to do with the reality within the computer that is basically electric activity. But the software creates an icon so that you can relate to the activity there. So similarly, our minds are not bringing reality. Our mind is bringing a kind of icon, a representation of reality, which for the most part we see distorted. But Annie Besant says, for now, it will suffice to consider the illusions caused by the nature of the mind. Right now, we are not going to go into that deeper aspect of illusion that the mind produces. Let us first make sure that at least our minds, or we learn how to use our minds without adding distortion to the representation of reality that we perceive. Very different would be our ideas of the world if we could know it as it is, even in its phenomenal aspect. The phenomenal aspect is the appearances that I was talking about. And this is by no means impossible, although it can only be done by those who have made great progress in controlling the mind. The vibrations of the mind can be stilled, the consciousness being withdrawn from it. An impact from without will then shape an image exactly corresponding to itself, the vibrations being identical in quality and quantity, not mixed with the vibrations belonging to the observer. So what she says here is, if we learn to still the mind, to stop this constant process of thinking and producing images, when we do that, our consciousness is withdrawn from the lower mind. So it's like all of a sudden the mind is a still lake, a still pond, and the reflection of the moon can be reflected there without being distorted. And we as consciousness are looking on the surface of this pond, and by those means we are cognizing what is out there. So if we, or as we learn to quiet the mind, then we learn to perceive things without the conditioning of the mind there. As I mentioned before, it is by these practices of trying to be in the present moment, aware, paying attention, practicing in meditation, dwelling in quiet or silent awareness. All this is part of the training to be able to, at least for the time being, still the mind so that it becomes a proper mirror without adding distortion. The the last chapters of the book that Annie Besant presents are all about this kind of training. We will see that in a second part of this series, after this series ends. Right now, what Annie Besant is going to focus on is the process of how we can change our minds so that our minds become able to be still. Because as she says, we may will the mind to be still, and it's not going to happen. There is a gradual change that needs to happen. That graduality may be faster or slower, but in the Theosophical view, there is a graduality whenever we are talking about matter. When we talk about consciousness, there is no time. There can be some instantaneous perception. You may have an insight into something instantaneously. But then to be able to sustain that insight, you need a mental body that can retain it, that can be molded by that insight. And changing the mental body so that it becomes a proper receptacle of those kind of insights, that takes time because we are dealing with matter, and matter always has its own inertia. So anyway, the main point that she says here, we are not limited necessarily to this intrinsic quality of the mind of producing illusions. We can break free, but as she's going to develop later, and there is a work that we need to do for that. There is another option. She says the consciousness may go forth and ensoul the observed object, and thus directly experience its vibrations. In both cases, a true knowledge of the form is gained. So this is sometimes what is described in Samadhi. There is, our consciousness begins to perceive from the object of perception, becomes one with the object of perception. And then that's also another way to see things as they are. As she says, knowledge of the form is gained. We are still in the phenomenal aspect, in the aspect of the appearance. To actually see the essence of anything, we have to go beyond the mind. But to be able to perceive things as they appear, as they really are at the level of appearance, we can either learn to perceive from a quiet silent perception, or we may learn to project our consciousness. Of course, that's more difficult. So she says the idea in the world of noumena is the opposed to phenomena. Phenomena is appearance, how things look. Noumena is the essence, the cause. So she says the idea in the world of noumena, of which the form expresses a phenomenal aspect, an appearance, may also be known, but only by the consciousness working in the causal body and trammeled by the concrete mind or the lower vehicles. So that's what I was mentioning. You have to go beyond the mind, beyond the mental body. Remember, when we talk about mind in this context, we are talking about the mental body. And then in other writings, she explains, on the causal body, you perceive the true appearance of things. If you raise your consciousness to the higher state that follows, that is called buddhi in Theosophical literature, then you become one with the essence of that which you are perceiving, because at the level of the Buddhic plane, there is unity. So that would be the way to perceive the essence of something. So she continues, the truth that we only know our impressions of things, not the things, is of vital moment when it is applied in practical life. It teaches humility and caution and readiness to listen to new ideas. we lose our instinctive certainty that we are right in our observations and learn to analyze ourselves before we condemn others. So this is very important, as she says. As we realize the limitations of the mind, especially when we really start seeing that, first we read it from a book, we hear it from somebody. This is the first step. There is somebody saying the mind is limited, and that has its own value. But when we begin to look at our minds, we start becoming aware of how the mind interprets situations, how the mind leads us into certain reactions that, when we are not under the effects of the situation, for example, we may we may think I should have chosen differently. When we actually begin to see by ourselves how the mind imposes its own conditioning, then there is this humility that comes, not in a defeating way. There is just the sense of what my mind is bringing is not necessarily what is really out there. This may seem, self-defeating if we think that that's all we are. If I think I am my mind and I see the limitations that I, as a mind, have, then we may come to a cynical point of view or nihilistic, as I was mentioning. But when we see this not just as a concept, when we see it as a practice, every time we see the limitations of the mind, our consciousness is actually looking as if from above, we are actually beginning to experience a kind of consciousness that is beyond the concrete mind. So along with the discovery of the limitations of the mind comes an intuition that becomes stronger and stronger, an intuition that we are more than this. So it's easier to accept the limitations of the mind without having a sense, as I was saying, of disappointment or lack of self-confidence or whatever may come from that. We simply realize, well, this is an instrument, it's valuable, but I can't take what the mind brings as a full proved authority. I have to apply a higher discernment and look at and see how the mind may be distorting things. So this pause before we judge in a very, strong and perhaps inflexible way, people or situations, etc., we learn to pause. We learn to be more cautious. We should be continually trying to enlarge our receptive capacity. We must become as the white light in which all colors are present, which distorts none because it rejects none, and has in itself the power to answer to each. We may measure our approach to this by our power of response to the most diverse characters. So before this, she was explaining, you can go to the book, she was explaining how many times we may feel in tune with certain people simply because the way in which my mental body vibrates resonates with the aura of the other person. Because my mental body has the ability to respond only to certain kind of vibrations, then I feel connected to certain kind of people. But she says, if as we grow, our mental body becomes able to respond to all vibrations. It's not longer blue or red or green. Now it becomes white in the sense that the white light is the synthesis of all the colors. The red light is, the material that is red is absorbing all kinds of colors except for the red one that bounces off, let's say. the white light or the white object has the ability to receive all and reject none of them. So this is a metaphor. She says, we need to learn how to relate to people who are different, situations who are not natural for us, things that moves us out of our comfort zone, let's say. What we call comfort zone is just that which vibrates in a similar way to our mental body or to our emotional body. And remaining within our comfort zone is really stagnating in the process of growth. What we want is to expand our ability to understand, not conceptually, to understand in the sense of being able to relate to. And this is part of the training in developing a mind that is far more powerful and far less restrictive on the self. So let's see a little more in detail how is this question of building our mental body, the building and evolution of the mental body. So she says, mental bodies evolve and grow under laws. To understand and apply these laws is to change the slow evolution by nature to the rapid growth by the self-determining intelligence. Hence the profound importance of their study, the study of these laws. So I mentioned this in the previous class, the idea of artificial evolution, which is there in science. Basically, from a spiritual point of view, we accelerate the rate of evolution when we are working specifically in a particular direction with the knowledge of how things work so that we can, maximize the effort in a way. I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but basically it's working with the laws. So understanding how the mind works, how the mind is built, etc., is of great help in producing this growth more rapidly. Waking or sleeping, we are ever building our mental bodies. For when consciousness vibrates, it affects the mental matter surrounding it. And every quiver of consciousness, though it be due only to a passing thought, draws into the mental body some particles of mental matter and shakes out other particles from it. So remember, she in our previous class we saw, consciousness vibrates, that generates a vibration in the mental body, for example. That generates a vibration in the mental atmosphere around us, and those vibrations are communicated to other minds. We can pass the vibration in that way on the mental plane, or we can pass the vibration down from the mental body to the astral, from the astral to the physical, and that's how we bring the thoughts into our brain. We will see this in the next class. But basically, what we need to keep in mind here is that a change in consciousness produces a change in the matter that forms the vehicle of consciousness. And the opposite is also true. A change in the matter of the vehicle induces a change in consciousness. This coordinated change is how we can acquire knowledge from outside or communicate something to the outside. Now she says, every motion in consciousness makes matter vibrate, and it draws into the mental body similar matter to the one that is being activated. There is like a kind of magnetism. So when certain kind, remember there are 7 different kinds of mental matter. When a certain kind is vibrating, it tends to attract magnetically similar matter. And whatever level it is vibrating. And at the same time, when more matter is entering, matter from the other levels are being expelled, let's say, from the system. And this other matter, as she says, are shaken out of the mental body. So we are constantly selecting what kind of matter forms our mental body. This is how the mental body is fed. We are constantly, with our thinking, we are feeding our mental body. Now, the fineness or coarseness of the matter thus appropriated depends on the quality of the vibrations set up by consciousness. Pure and lofty thoughts are composed of rapid vibrations and can only affect the rare and subtle grades of mental body, so the higher grades of mental body matter. The coarse grades remain unaffected, being unable to vibrate at the necessary speed. She would explain in other writings that the higher matter can vibrate faster, the lower matter, being denser, grosser, is slower, it's closer to the idea of solid that we have on the physical plane. So there are certain vibrations that this lower, denser matter on the mental plane just cannot respond to. And when this happens, when the mental body is set to a vibration of a certain rate, all the matter that cannot respond to that is pushed out of the mental body. Not all of it, little by little. This is something that happens continuously. So she says, when such a thought causes the mental body to vibrate, particles of the coarser matter are shaken out of the body, and their place is taken by particles of the finer grades. Similarly, base and evil thoughts draw into the mental body the coarser materials suitable for their own expression, and these materials repel and drive out the finer kinds. So in regular mental activity, there is a constant flux of mental matter. And mental matter responding to all these different kind of thoughts. So part of the spiritual practice is to gradually reduce the instances in which we engage in negative thoughts and emotions, but she's looking at the mental aspect here, and increase the instances in which we engage in positive thoughts. By positive, I don't mean what we normally think as positive thinking, which from this point of view many times is negative, because the so-called positive thinking is many times very selfish thinking. So from this point of view, all selfish thinking is negative, is part of the coarser part of the mind. By positive thoughts, I mean those who are in tune with love, compassion, unity, the general goodness, etc. So she continues, according to the kind of matter we have built into our mental bodies in the past, remember we inherit the mental body from our past incarnations, will be our power of responding to the thoughts which now reach us from outside. If our mental bodies are composed of fine materials, coarse and evil thoughts will meet with no response, and hence can inflict no injury. Whereas if they are built up with gross materials, they will be affected by every evil passerby and will remain irresponsive to and unbenefited by the good. So there are constantly influences coming to us, produced by people, produced by cycles on our planet, produced by the enlightened beings and Mahatmas, as they are called in the Theosophical tradition. There are the influences coming from our own soul. There are always influences coming to us. But then how receptive we are to those influences depends on what kind of receptor we have built at the level of our mental body or our emotional body. So if our mental body is built of mostly of spiritual matter, let's say, spiritual mental matter, then it will be more receptive to things like beauty, inspiration, spiritual thoughts. Also, in dealing with these subjects, sometimes you may want to share this point of view with some people who may not be able to grasp it or to see the relevance. And assuming that what you are saying is true or closer to truth, the reason would be because the mental body of that person is not built with the kind of matter that is receptive to that point of view. Of course, we have to be always careful, because everybody that has an idea thinks that his or her idea is right. So when somebody else is trying to convince you of something that you think is wrong, that person could also think, okay, you don't have the right kind of mental matter to perceive it. So be always careful not to use any of these teachings to generate a sense of arrogance or superiority or something like that. So as a principle, a truth will not be able to be perceived by a person that doesn't have that kind of mental organization. And the contrary is also true. People may be more liable to untruth or ourselves if our mental bodies are built with this lower kind of matter, because the lower kind of matter has to do more with ignorance, with a sense of selfishness and self-centeredness, etc. So she continues, if we would have mental bodies which should be strong, well vitalized, active, able to grasp loftier thoughts presented to us, then we must steadily work at right thinking, for we are our own builders and fashion our own minds for ourselves. And she gives an advice here on how one of the ways to begin to reshape the mental body. She says, many people are great readers. Now, reading does not build the mind. Thought alone builds it. And remember that by thought, she means an inquiry, a kind of pondering over, not just a regular conditioned thought. Reading is only valuable as it furnishes materials for thought. Mental growth happens in proportion to the amount of thought expended in the reading. Unless a person takes up the information and works on it, he or she is likely to suffer from overloading and to weaken rather than strengthen under the burden of unassimilated ideas. So we tend to think that incorporating information is the way to exercise our minds, to be smarter, or whatever, however we put it. And Besant says, actually, that's not the case. Sure, you can fill your memory with facts. Having facts in your memory may be useful, in daily life in some ways, but that is not going to make you more intelligent. And by intelligent, we mean something deeper than just the lower concrete mental ability. You will grow in your ability to grasp reality in your relationships, in life, about yourself, only when we talk at the level of the mental body, only by engaging in an inquiry out of what you read or hear. So she continues, we should read less and think more if we would have our minds grow and our intelligence develop. If we are in earnest in the culture of our minds, we should daily spend an hour in the study of some serious and weighty book, and reading for 5 minutes, we should think for 10, and so on through the hour. So this is something that Blavatsky also recommended. Regardless of the proportion, this is just for the purpose of examples. The idea is first, get a weighty book, as she says, a book that has substance. We tend to want to have things that we don't have to work a lot for. Early theosophical books, this including, are difficult to understand. Sometimes it's a question of the language. Language evolves and the style may be, a little difficult for us to understand. But many times it's because there are deep philosophical concepts there. And we naturally tend to think that, we should not have to work a lot at understanding something. That, a good writer is one that explains things as clearly as possible. And although it is good from a certain point of view, there is a loss there. There is the loss that when things are very clear, we do very little work. That's why, even though I strive to try to present these teachings as clearly as possible, I always recommend go and read the original text, because you have to do your own work also. And being in touch with a clear explanation about something may be very useful to help you get into the subject, to get some practical ideas of how you can lead your life, to inspire you in a certain direction, and all those things are very useful. But when it comes to the growth of your mental intelligence, of the ability of the mental body to present these kind of ideas, you have to do the work. So get a serious book, a deep book, read and pause. You don't need to be measuring the time. Just read. Whenever there is a concept that you feel that it has some depth, pause, reread that, stay in silence, then try to probe into the concept. What does that mean? Try to visualize it. How would that be applied to my life? It's a process of dialoguing with the book rather than simply being passive and letting information come. So finally, she says, at first we will find the effort tiresome and laborious, and we will discover the weakness of our thinking power. This discovery marks our first step. People who cannot think, but who imagine that they can, do not make much progress. With regular and persistent, but not excessive, exercise, the thought power will grow as the muscle power grows. Without this thinking, the mental body will remain loosely formed and unorganized, and without gaining concentration, thought power cannot be exercised at all. So in order to develop a powerful thought that can be used to help people, we need to start working on the evolution of the mental body, so that the mental body is clearly organized. It's not just a cloud of mental matter around us. It's clearly defined, organized, quiet, able to represent sharply and correctly without distortions what comes from outside, able to connect the different images. All this is part of having a mental body that begins to be a useful tool for the self.